Cottage cheese is having a moment right now, all over social media, all over grocery store shelves. Suddenly the it food for anyone trying to eat more protein without cooking a whole chicken breast every night. And that surge in popularity means the shelf that used to hold 2 or 3 sad tubs now holds 9 or 10 different brands all screaming about protein content and probiotics and grass-fed cows. So we decided to actually sit down, read every single label, compare the ingredient lists side by side, and figure out which of these cottage cheese brands are genuinely worth your money and which ones are just riding the trend with a lot of marketing and not much substance. And what we found was honestly more interesting than we expected, because cottage cheese, this simple curdled milk product that our grandparents ate with canned peaches, has quietly become a battleground between old school dairy processing and this new wave of cleaner, higher protein, better cultured products. And the differences between brands are bigger than you'd think. So let's start with the basics of what actually makes a good cottage cheese, because that's going to matter. For everything that follows, the core things we looked at were the ingredient list length, because a lot of mainstream cottage cheese brands pad their ingredients with gums, like carabine gum, guar gum, and xanthan gum to create that thick, creamy texture artificially instead of getting it from the natural culturing process. We looked at protein per serving, since that's the whole reason most people are buying this stuff in the first place. We looked at sodium levels because cottage cheese can be surprisingly salty, and that varies a lot. Brand to brand, we looked at whether the milk came from grass-fed or pasture-raised cows, whether the brand used live and active cultures, which matters for gut health benefits. And finally, we looked at price per ounce, because some of these are shockingly expensive for what is essentially a basic dairy staple, starting with the big conventional grocery store brands, the ones you've probably been buying without a second thought for years. Brands like Breakstones and Knudsen fall into this category. And what we found is pretty typical for conventional processed dairy. The ingredient lists are longer than you'd expect for something that should just be milk, cream, salt, and cultures. You'll often see modified food starch, guar gum, carrageenan in some formulations, and mono and diglycerides. These aren't necessarily dangerous in the amounts used, but they are there specifically to mimic a creaminess that the product isn't naturally achieving through fermentation. And the protein content on these tends to sit in that standard 11 to 14 grams per half cup range, which is fine, but not exceptional. Sodium also tends to run on the higher side with these more processed options, often approaching 400 milligrams per serving, which adds up fast if you're eating a full cup for a meal like so many people do now. On the plus side, these are widely available and cheap. So if budget is your primary concern, they're not the worst choice. They're just not the star of this comparison. Moving up a tier, we looked at brands like Daisy, which markets itself heavily on having a short ingredient list. And when we actually checked, Daisy does deliver on that promise better than most of the conventional brands. Their ingredient list is genuinely short, typically just cultured milk, cream, and salt, no gums, no stabilizers, which is honestly kind of rare at this price point. The trade-off is that because there's no stabilizer helping hold everything together, the texture can be a little more watery or separated in the tub compared to the thicker mainstream brands. Some people love that more natural curd texture, and some people find it off-putting. If they're used to the artificially thickened stuff, protein content is comparable to the conventional brands. Nothing standout. But the clean label is a real point in its favor if ingredient quality is what you're optimizing for. Then there's the whole category of brands specifically built around the high protein trend. And this is where things get more complicated, because a brand can put a huge number on the front of the package and still have an ingredient list you might not love. Good Culture is probably the most recognizable name in this space right now. And to their credit, they do combine a genuinely clean ingredient list with meaningfully higher protein numbers than most conventional brands. They use live and active cultures. They're made without artificial preservatives, and they lean into that whole gut health angle with probiotic strains listed specifically on the label, which not every brand bothers to do. The trade-off with Good Culture and similar brands in this tier is price. You're often paying closer to $7 or $8 for a container that would cost $3 or $4 in the conventional aisle, so you're paying a real premium for that cleaner formulation and higher protein density. Whether that premium is worth it really depends on your budget and how much you value. Avoiding stabilizers versus just hitting a protein number next, we looked at some of the brands specifically chasing the ultra-high protein trend that blew up on social media. These are the tubs advertising 25 or even 30 grams of protein per serving. And this is honestly where we'd urge some caution, because the way a lot of these brands hit those inflated protein numbers is by adding milk protein concentrate or whey protein isolate on top of the base cottage cheese curd, which isn't inherently bad. Added protein is still protein, but it does change what you're actually eating. It's no longer just simple cultured dairy, it's a fortified product. And often that fortification comes with a noticeably different, sometimes gummier or pastier texture, and usually a higher price tag to match the marketing. So if you're specifically chasing a protein number for a fitness goal, these can genuinely make sense as a convenient option. But if what you actually want is traditional, minimally processed cottage cheese, you should know that the ultra-high protein versions are a meaningfully different product, not just a better version of the same thing. We also spent some time on the organic and grass-fed tier. Brands like Nancy's and Kelowna Supernatural fall here, and these tend to check almost every box we cared about. Short ingredient lists, live active cultures, milk sourced from pasture-raised or grass-fed cows, and typically no added gums or stabilizers at all. Nancy's in particular has a strong reputation for probiotic diversity, often listing several distinct live culture strains, rather than just the one or two you'll see on a basic label. The texture on these organic options tends to be a little looser and more traditional, closer to what cottage cheese looked like before food manufacturers started optimizing for shelf stability and thick, spoonable texture. And again, the trade-off is cost. These are consistently among the most expensive options we compared, sometimes nearly double what you'd pay for a conventional grocery store tub. So this tier makes the most sense if you're already someone who prioritizes organic and grass-fed sourcing across your grocery list generally. We also checked a few store brand and private label options because a lot of people assume store brand automatically means lower quality, and that wasn't really true here. Some of the private label options we looked at had surprisingly short ingredient lists and reasonable protein numbers at a noticeably lower price point than the name brand equivalents. The main inconsistency with store brands is that formulations can vary more and sometimes change without much notice. So what you liked last month might have a slightly different ingredient list this month. That's worth keeping an eye on. If you find a store brand you like, it's worth periodically rechecking the label rather than assuming it's identical every time. Another factor that doesn't get talked about enough is curd size and fat content, because these affect how satisfying and versatile the cottage cheese actually is in cooking, and not just as a straight snack. Small curd versions tend to blend more smoothly if you're using cottage cheese in things like pancake batter, whipped cottage cheese bowls, or as a yogurt substitute in baking, while large curd versions hold their texture better if you're eating it plain with fruit or vegetables. Fat content also varies more than people realize, with options ranging from fat-free all the way up to 4% milk fat. And the fat-free versions often lean more heavily on stabilizers and gums to make up for the mouthfeel that fat would otherwise provide naturally, which loops back to that ingredient list issue we kept coming back to throughout this whole comparison. So pulling this all together, if we had to rank these into simple categories based on everything we found, the best overall value considering ingredient quality, taste, and price would go to the mid-tier brands like Daisy and Good Culture. They hit a sensible balance of clean ingredients and reasonable cost without going to the extreme premium end. The best choice specifically for people chasing high protein numbers for fitness purposes would be the fortified ultra-high protein brands, as long as you go in understanding that they're a modified product rather than traditional cottage cheese. The best choice if organic and grass-fed sourcing is your top priority would be Nancy's or Kelowna, despite the higher price and the best budget option. That still doesn't compromise too much on ingredient quality would actually be some of the private label store brands, provided you're willing to periodically double-check the label since formulations can shift. What we'd caution against, or at least suggest reading labels carefully before buying, are the more heavily processed conventional brands that combine a long list of gums and stabilizers with a fairly average protein number and a higher sodium content, because you're essentially not getting a clear advantage in exchange for those additives. That's true of a decent chunk of the mainstream cottage cheese aisle, even now with all this reformulation happening across the category. At the end of the day, cottage cheese is a genuinely useful food. It's versatile, it's high in protein, it works in sweet and savory dishes, and the fact that so many brands are now competing on cleaner ingredients and better culturing is honestly a good thing for consumers. Even if it means more label reading at the grocery store, a real takeaway from doing this comparison is that the front of the package, all those bold protein numbers and health claims, tells you a lot less than flipping the container over and actually reading the ingredient list and nutrition panel for yourself. Because two tubs can both say high protein in big letters and be genuinely different products once you look past the marketing. So next time you're standing in that dairy aisle trying to decide between 9 or 10 tubs that all look pretty similar, take the extra 30 seconds to flip it around. Check where the milk comes from, check whether there are gums and stabilizers padding out the ingredient list, check the sodium, and decide what actually matters most for what you're trying to get out of your cottage cheese, whether that's a clean, simple snack, a protein boost for your workouts, or just something to put on toast with a little pepper and hot sauce like the rest of us have apparently rediscovered how to enjoy.